Thanks, Eva, for introduction. As a lawyer and previously as a risk manager, and particularly correspondent banking risk manager, I will try to cover some experiences from my practice and also really sort of go deep and wide, expecting that later on during the Q&A session you will be able to ask me different questions and we can go into the topics that are most interesting to you. Correspondent banking services is probably one of the financial services that has been most affected by AML regulation. So definitely it is the topic dear and near to my heart. So what I will try to cover in those brief 20 minutes, and I say brief because I really tend to talk a lot, so you will notice. So the risking and decline of correspondent banking services, practical dilemmas of opening up to new financial players for the legacy banks, and on the other hand, ensuring AML CTF requirements for all the market players. And what is next for correspondent banking? So probably not really taking a guessing game, but just speculating from what is currently happening in the market. So if we try to map out some landmarks of the risking and decline of correspondent banking, we should probably go a little bit back to financial crisis of 2007 and 2008. Because that is then, this defining moment for financial industry happened and really shaped the management of all kinds of risk, including AML risk. Yet I started with 2012 FATF recommendations. Recommendation 13 covers specifically correspondent banking, but what might be sort of news for you, it does not differ much from 2003 FATF recommendation on correspondent banking. So what has happened and why 2012 recommendation was taken differently by the market? It is because the entire regulatory focus has switched to risk-based approach, meaning that if previously you could have relied on ticking a list and saying, if I have this and this in place, and if I manage to serve my correspondents well, I might be on the safe side. So with 2012 FATF recommendation and risk-based approach, every single institution had to second-guess their own risk management strategies, especially towards correspondent banking. And despite the fact that in 2013, FATF issued another guidance on financial inclusion, sort of reverting their own statement that, okay, correspondent banking is high risk, and guys, you should really look at it and take care of it, they started really worrying about the fact, the detrimental effects and the ripple effects it started taking on the market. This led us to 2015, and the fourth AML directive. The fourth AML directive specifically regulates correspondent banking. It does send a message. And yet at the same year, Financial Stability Board reported to G20 that correspondent banking services have been tremendously shrinking. And by shrinking, I do not only mean that the number of correspondent relations decreased, it also concentrated, leaving blind spots in the market. So, if we talk about Americas, not North America, but specifically South and Latin America, if we talk about Asia, and even if we talk about Eastern Europe, these regions and these financial markets suffer tremendously. Then, moving quick to 2016, we have FATF guidance on correspondent banking services. And FATF started becoming really clear with their message on not over-regulating and not overreacting. So, regulatory body, the AML guru in the market started saying that, okay, guys, we should probably really just, take a step back and think about how we handle correspondent banking instead of just seizing it. However, on the other hand, the Wolfsburg Group issued guidance on swift RMA due diligence. And this has also taken a toll on the market in a sense that, if we only have RMA relationship, which is or has been perceived as a slightest risk relationship, we still need to look at it, we still need to evaluate it, we still need to manage the risk. Then moving quickly to 2017, what happened in the Baltics? We'll know that Deutsche, as one of the biggest correspondents for the Baltics, retreated from Latvia and Estonia. It stayed in Lithuania, sort of good news, and we in our small markets try to pride ourselves saying, okay, we're slightly different, maybe a little bit better, but no, not really, because all the global banks really look at this market the same. And Equity issued the report saying that correspondent banking relations dropped by 25%. So the decrease and the detrimental effects were huge. Interesting fact is that SWIFT also sort of monitors this constantly, and they do agree as well that the correspondent banking relationship drops, the correspondent corridors shrinked. However, the amount of messages increased. What does it mean? From the risk perspective, it means that it takes many more steps to effect a transaction, many more messages towards the final beneficiary, which increases, in fact, the risk of losing information and of really just exposing other intermediary banks to the same risks that all the correspondents carry. In 2018, just last year, Wolfsburg issued a new correspondent banking due diligence questionnaire. The difference was huge, because the updated questionnaire, if we compare it with the previous one, for those who still remember, 3 pages. The new one, 21? It's quite a big difference, and if you have it properly filled, it's quite a read. So, the guidance was there, but the indication towards the effort that has to be put in due diligence process of correspondent banking relationship was also quite clear. The 50 AML directive, quite a good step forward, because it clarified one thing. If everyone in correspondent banking risk management were second-guessing themselves and thinking, when we talk about correspondent banking management, do we include all type of correspondent banking services? Does it include RMA-only relationship? So the 50 AML directive from this perspective said, from risk, we need to focus on correspondent banking services for third countries and also excluding only messaging services. Quite a relief for risk management community, but still, last year we started facing the ripple effects of previous actions, meaning we were faced with Baltic AML scandals, which in turn meant that global correspondents started really looking into our markets and started really giving strong signals. They might reduce dollar clearance, they might actually retreat from these markets. So not a very fun timeline to look at, but let us talk about more practical dilemmas for individual players. What does it mean for correspondents or for those players who could be ready to offer financial services to the others? Under PSD2, you're actually now obliged to apply the so-called POND principles. Your approach towards any other financial institution should be proportionate, objective, and non-discriminatory. Easy to say, much more difficult to apply in practice, because due diligence processes are not yet so well synchronized within institutions to really understand the risk and to really manage it evenly across the market. Restrictions of global correspondence. This is something that you cannot really joke with. If your global correspondent says, for instance, that they do not want you to route payments of a particular segment clients, high-risk clients, or even particular industry clients, like fintech companies, you will not be doing that. And this means you cannot extend the same service to your counterparties. It is still quite difficult to understand one's role in the payment chain. And the Deutsche and Danske combinatory scandal just showed the fact that even if you are not the perpetrator or the service provider, you can be put under the train. Recent developments. This is the fun part, because it sort of gives hope on how this can be managed on a daily basis. Dedicated competencies, yes. This is something that we're already starting noticing in legacy institutions. I don't know how many of you have these daily hurdles of trying to open accounts with legacy banks, or trying to strike maybe even a broader relationship. But you probably are already talking not to business managers, but to dedicated personnel, meaning risk managers, KYC officers, or ML officers. This is a good news, especially for global banks. Global banks that increase their correspondent relationship portfolios actually have a very good possibility to increase their competent staff. Some global banks that we have been in close touch with indicated that specifically dedicated staff for managing correspondent relationship risk has increased not by 1 or 2 people, but by 10, by 20. So these are huge teams managing this particular segment. Clear risk appetite. This is something that's still, I think, quite a struggle for the industry. But if you take, for example, Barclays, they, not so recently, actually quite a while ago, published their risk appetite statement, 12 something points that any PSP should comply with in order for them to approach for financial services. So this is public. This is certainly compliant with bond principles, and this is something that it is a clear message to the market. If you are the organization that matches all the criteria, then we would like to work with you. Not easy to match, I remind you, if you read it, some criteria are still quite broad and still indicate that we might judge you based on your risk appetite. We might judge you based on the geographies you serve. We might judge you based on your client portfolio. But it is a clear list that you can start a conversation from. If we talk about practical dilemmas for new financial institutions, then obviously the feeling is that, bond principles probably are not working properly yet. The sort of, undercurrent feeling is that most likely it's not going to happen with correspondent banking services, or if it happens very slowly. With all the banks probably that you would approach locally, you most likely would hear that account opening might take, not days, not weeks, but months. And for new businesses, this is not good news. Yet this is the reality, especially if you're really just starting operations and if it is really difficult to do a proper due diligence on your business. Because this is a requirement and this is the safeguard that all correspondents would be using. Is seamless compliance possible? So this is a question that, it's a question, but it's not a question really. Because the feeling is that it is not. And despite the fact that you might have a very good business product, technologically advanced, which, gives you an edge with regards to your customers and in comparison to legacy institutions, the news about compliance is still rather oldish. It's not that you have to do it the old way, although for legacy institutions, it's easy to understand if you demonstrate it the old way. However, it still means that you cannot reduce it to be a minimum. risk appetite versus risk capacity. This is something that I've been struggling with in my own experience, and I see Thomas in the audience. We've been struggling together. The thing about risk appetite and risk capacity and the newcomers that sit across the table and try to describe the business model to you and try to describe their portfolio to you and their technical capacity to manage risks and how good your partnership would be, the lingering feeling is that risk capacity is not measured against risk appetite. And we do understand that the newcomers most probably will be filling a different niche than local, legacy, conservative banks. And it is okay. What is probably a suggestion or a recommendation, you might take it either way, is to really describe your risk appetite properly. Do not try to sell what is not there, and really try to show internal controls rather than the client segment that the conservative bank would like to see or understand. It is okay you have different clients. It is okay for the bank to not agree with your risk appetite. What is probably a losing game for you if you do not show proper internal control measures. So this is something that, is a constant struggle for legacy institutions to understand about newcomers, or sometimes even to catch, which is also very bad news. If any newcomer starts engaging in a game, catch me if you can, I will be doing what I'm doing and you try to figure out what I'm doing, this is probably not a good way to start partnership. And if you take into account the fact that correspondent banking initially or originally has been relations between, two equal institutions, two banks equally regulated, even if in different jurisdictions, but, with same things to lose and same things to gain, you did have, or you used to have, rather, an even relationship, which was based on one hand, on gentleman agreements. If I informed my correspondent previously that, okay, in 1 month, I will not be servicing this and this type of transactions, I would know for sure that my correspondent would respect that. The current environment, this is not a given. So it is a struggle, both for newcomers and for legacy institutions. And attracting the necessary competences. I know that Rosita will be talking about this extensively, so I will just briefly mention that for any newcomer, in my own personal opinion, having solid, competent compliance function is really key. And why is that? Because despite the fact that you might have the best business product, if you come to talk to legacy institution, if you try to present how you manage the risk of this technologically advanced solution, you will still be facing the same AML questions. What is your client portfolio? What is your risk appetite? How you're going to monitor your transactions? And how you will resolve any compliance issue. Not to sound too pessimistic on this, what could be next for correspondent banking, despite the fact that it's been shrinking? Clarifying regulatory expectations and harmonizing the standards. This is already happening, and is, well, fortunately, sometimes unfortunately, not entirely our task. This has been happening on really high levels, and it's good if we pitch in with our own business experience to affect that, because the standards, as we have seen from the timeline, have been misunderstood on quite some occasions and have been misread. So it's good if we really do try to influence the standards. Strengthening internal due diligence capacities. As mentioned previously, this is truly key. Despite the fact what you might have internally, the clients as such and their risks remain very similar. And how you understand the clients and how you capture those inherent risks is really about what competence you have in-house. Adequate control measures from quality risk assessments. This will also be covered quite extensively, but I cannot stress enough how important it is for any institution to do this properly in order to have a very even and very efficient conversation with their counterparties, to individualized monitoring. This is where we are moving, and I think the newcomers are moving much faster towards this, towards more individualized monitoring. The legacy institutions are slightly struggling with that bit, but I think we are getting there. And moving towards customer-centric experience, also called Correspondent Banking 3.0. I think what this gives us as a very good hope is if you talk with legacy institutions that provide universal services, and you are a niche player having really strong competence in one or two areas, you can really strike a good partnership for the benefit of your customers and for the benefit of your business. So this is something that we already have examples in the market of, and it could be a good way forward. And I see zeros on the clock, which means I'm in time. So thank you so much, and I will be looking forward to your questions.